All right, well, welcome online summer 2019 classes. We are now moving into the last major segment of what we're covering throughout this semester, the last 4 chapters of the text. So, of course, for test 3, that will be from chapters 11 through 15. But chapters 12 through 15 deal with the 3 branches of government, and as I've mentioned before, the one unofficial branch, the bureaucracy. So we'll first look at the legislative branch, Congress, Chapter 12, Congress. And this brings us back to Chapter 2 in the text, as we covered the 2 plans and the debate over creating and supporting the new Constitution, Philadelphia in 1787. And you had the large state plan from Virginia and the small state plan from New Jersey. Combine the 2 together, you end up with the Connecticut Compromise, and you end up then with the current Congress that we have today, and representation based on population in the House of Representatives, and representation equal among the states from the New Jersey plan. So the Senate, where you have equal representation, every state has 2 senators. That includes Wyoming, which really, in its overall population, doesn't have enough to carry out more than 1 representative, and actually doesn't even have enough for a representative in other states. And so you have roughly over 800,000 people today that would make up 1 district for a House of Representatives seat. And so you have 53 House of Representative members in California, and Oklahoma has 5. That's, of course, the representation based on the overall population of the state. And then you have to draw the districts in a way to evenly reflect the populations, evenly represent those populations. This leads to some considerable distortions, even in a state like Oklahoma. If we may think that our state is primarily still a rural state, that's just not really accurate. You're looking at a large amount of the population that lives in either the Tulsa metropolitan area or the Oklahoma City metropolitan area, or the roughly 100 miles between Tulsa and Oklahoma. And I would imagine everyone in this class, or almost everyone, has been in that area. Many of you are from that area. And so, as you can see here, districts 1 and 5 are pretty small in terms of land size. District 3 goes all the way to the suburbs of Tulsa, a city like Sapulpa, for example, and goes all the way to the New Mexico border in the Panhandle. And our district, where we're located here in Ottawa County, the extreme northeast part of the state of Oklahoma, District 2 goes all the way from the border of Missouri and Kansas all the way down to the Texas border, so also a very large district. Now, when it comes to re-electing the people who are representing those districts, we can see that, or those states, a large amount of them are re-elected. So the incumbent, the person who holds the position, has a considerable amount of success when it comes to the re-election bid. And so even in some recent midterm elections where we had an idea that a great number of people were upset with those in positions of authority, most of them were re-elected. Now, in both cases, 2010 and also in 2018. So if you notice here, 8.7% of House incumbents were defeated. That then means, though, that you had somewhere over 90%, of course, that were reelected. But there were a large amount of House incumbents that decided not to run for reelection. So that's always important to take into consideration. Nevertheless, when those incumbents decide to run for re-election, most of the time they are going to be successful. Why is that the case? Why are incumbents, despite the fact that there's oftentimes complaints about incumbents, why are they re-elected? One reason is money. And so you'll see this brought out certainly in chapter 10, chapter 11, and now here in chapter 12, the use of money in politics. And it makes sense that the organizations that are contributing large amounts of money give most of that money to the incumbents. And then just also the recognition in a congressional district. The incumbent is much better known than the challengers in most situations. So they're just doing things that are in many ways public relations, photographs, sending pictures back to local newspapers and television channels, or certainly coming up with ways of helping a particular city or county with grants. Consider chapter 3 when we looked at federalism. So some of the ways in which members, incumbents, would help the folks back home. Perhaps not used as much anymore. A lot of people, of course, are communicating with email. But if you want to get letters from your members of Congress, they're mailed out stamp-free. And, of course, there can be newsletters that are mailed out. They're not supposed to be campaign-oriented and just to tell the constituency what's going on in Washington, D.C. and what they're working on. But that can certainly be a way of, once again, bringing up the attention of an incumbent to the voting public in the use of franking privileges. And perhaps most controversial of all is how the money's being spent. And so you have these special projects for a particular locale. It's oftentimes referred to as pork barrel politics. The suggestion here is that it's something that the money could be used in better ways, different ways. And so is it a waste of money? And certainly no one in Congress is going to say that they're deliberately wasting money. But is it a case in which the money should be used the way it is? When you come up with perhaps new research grants for a university that's looking into an agricultural issue, and maybe it's important, or maybe there's a better way to use that money. Spending more money on a defense contract in a particular company that's making a product for the defense department, and you have a district within, or you have a city within a congressional district that's getting most of that funding. The people that live in that city and work for that company, they probably don't view that as a waste of money. But if you're from the outside looking in, you may think that that's an example of pork barrel politics. So it's to interpret this in many ways is really based upon your outlook on that particular project. So let's just consider what we've briefly covered here, just the makeup of Congress, how people get into these positions, the changing the districts, and the makeup that's different in representation from the House and the Senate, drawing those districts, and then why the incumbents are so successful. Now we'll look at particular offices within Congress and why these offices have power. So the most powerful individual in Congress would be the Speaker of the House. And here we can see some of the reasons why the Speaker has such power. It might be worthwhile to pause this and write this down, look over these different powers of the Speaker. But also beyond those powers, you can see here that in the succession to be president, the Speaker has a very close connection there to the President. So the President and then the Vice President, which we probably all are aware of, that the Vice President would continue on the presidency after the President. But then what would happen if the President and the Vice President could not serve? And that's where you would have the Speaker. After the Speaker would be the President pro tempore. This is the senior member of the majority party in the Senate. So it's not a position that's really, it's not based on an election. It's given to, again, the most senior member of the majority party. But we can see here that this individual would also be in line to be president. This is a situation where the office of president has to be replaced in an immediate fashion. Now, having said that, that's been the expectation throughout the history of the United States. But it's never been perhaps that pressing throughout most times of history of the United States, although what I'm going to explain here is probably now, well, it's well over 70 years old. And that is the reality that at any given time, it's a very humbling and depressing reality, and that is that we're 30 minutes away from a nuclear holocaust at any given time. The demand then to make a decision on launching nuclear weapons. And that's why you can't leave the president's office vacant. You can't leave the next individual's position vacant. And we had a situation, the first president that died, William Henry Harrison, but that was back in the 1840s, that it took quite a few, at least hours, to inform the vice president, John Tyler, that he was now president. And we just would not have that situation today. Or if it did happen, it would be an extremely frightening situation for that to occur. Somebody has to be in that position to make incredible decisions. And these are other individuals that are in succession to be president. So I'm listing the major cabinet positions. So there's not a particular position called cabinet, but it's from then the president pro tempore, you go to the president's cabinet, starting with the most senior position, Secretary of State, and eventually you would get to the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. All those individuals would be in position to be president. We've got to think that if we ever had to use the Succession Act and you wake up tomorrow morning and you find out that the Secretary of Interior is now the president because everyone in front of the Secretary of Interior is unable to be president, I don't think that we really feel that comfortable about the situation. But nevertheless, that's the whole plan, and that's how it's supposed to work. So there we have, we'll just look at some of the leaders here in the House and the Senate. So Senator Grassley from Iowa, and a Republican from Iowa is the president pro tempore. If you want to watch a movie that is funny and one of the most darkest forms of humor about a nuclear war, watch the film Dr. Strangelove. And you will see in this film the real possibility that you could just have the two major nuclear powers of the world. At this time it was the Soviet Union, but today Russia, United States and Russia, in a way just kind of stumble and trip into nuclear holocaust. It's a frightening and again humbling way of thinking about this, but this is a film that I would strongly urge you to watch, and you can certainly get clips of it on YouTube, and may very well have this as a film that you can download from the library at NEO. So the current Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi, and Nancy Pelosi took over this position once the Democrats gained back the majority in the House of Representatives. So after the 2008 election in November, she was sworn in as Speaker in January 2019. And so this is the most powerful woman that we have had in American government. So let's look at, again, some of the other leaders within the House and the Senate. And I think it would be worthwhile to just keep in mind that it's not as if you have one individual that's running the government, that there are other people that have considerable influence within their institutions. So Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, Democrat from Maryland. James Clyburn, the House Majority Whip, Democrat from South Carolina, and we'll be bringing up some references to the power of the whips. The minority leader is Republican Kevin McCarthy from California. The minority whip is Stephen Scalise from Louisiana, Republican from Louisiana. Now, these leaders are going to meet within their caucuses, and we've used caucus in a different term, looking at a way to nominate candidates. But in this case, caucus is a collection of party members who would then vote for their leadership or make decisions on how they're going to approach a particular bill in the House or the Senate. So the leader would run the caucus. The whips would serve as assistants to the leader, but they would also have another job, and that job is to enforce party discipline. So I use the yin and yang symbol here because to enforce party discipline, they may be, in some situations, use a positive enforcement, and in other cases, some negative enforcement to try to get other members within that party to vote a certain way. So a carrot and stick approach, a yin and yang approach. So vote for a bill for someone who is fence sitting. Maybe they're not just coming out strongly one way or the other. And so the whip could say to that member of the caucus, well, if you're not going to vote for the bill, then we're not going to vote for a bill that you support. And so you want to vote for my bill, I'll vote for your bill. And that's referred to as log rolling. One member will support a particular bill if that other member will vote for another bill. And, you know, this is really, in some ways you can look this over and say that seems rather corrupt, but another way of looking at that is just a way that people who work with one another may negotiate to ensure some sort of protection, or just really in a way kind of moving the ball down the field in a way. And so partly what's done there is log rolling. But you can also, in this chapter, you'll see some references to powerful standing committees. These are committees, as you see here, that approve of legislation. And certainly a member of the House or the Senate would want to be on the most effective standing committees for that individual's district or state. And so these whips would have a great deal of authority in determining what standing committees these individuals would get to serve on. So they could then say, you vote for this bill, we're going to put you on a really good committee. Or maybe the negative approach there, if you don't vote for this bill, you're not going to get on this committee, or we're going to remove you from a particular committee. These are some of the more powerful standing committees, and they're referenced there in your text. As we can see here, you have some that are only in the House that have a great deal of authority. The Ways and Means Committee, which is the Tax Writing Committee, and then the Rules Committee, which is has far more authority in the House than it does in the Senate. And then perhaps the ultimate stick or carrot would be to say we're not going to support your re-election bid. That's probably the most drastic move, and I would assume rarely happens. And I mean, you could find some evidence of that by just a lack of financial support or a lack of any type of talent that's being sent, campaign workers, advisors, to a member of Congress that's running for re-election. But the importance of maintaining the numbers within the House would suggest that this very rarely is ever done. And on to the Senate. Here we have Vice President Mike Pence from Indiana, Republican, who is the presiding officer. Officially, the Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate. It may not necessarily have that much authority within the Senate, but if there was a tie, the Vice President would cast the deciding vote. The person who has the most authority within the Senate would be the majority leader, and this is Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky. I would think that most of you have heard the name Mitch McConnell somewhere along the way. John Cornyn from Texas, Republican, is the majority whip. The minority leader is Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York. And the minority whip from Illinois is Dick Durbin. In these cases, the whips would have the same type of job and same type of responsibilities as they would have in the House, and the same can be said for the majority and minority leaders. Well, I would assume somewhere along the way you've been exposed to this a little cartoon clip on how a bill becomes a law. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. Probably have seen that somewhere along the way. This has been out, I think, over 40 years now. And it, of course, is showing a fairly simplified process on how that takes place. But it's still worthwhile to see that. You can go to YouTube and see it. You also, though, have some details that are brought out on pages 489 to 494 about the process of how a bill becomes a law. So certainly focus on that part of your text. And here you can see some of those differences in that lawmaking process between the House and the Senate. The Senate has far more ability to slow down or even end the lawmaking process, and again, converting a bill into a law. It's less likely to be able to do that in the House. And so again, we talked about log rolling. You can call that vote trading. But I think it's worthwhile to consider, why do members of Congress vote the way they do? And you have two main factors that have a great deal of influence on how members of Congress would vote. So their constituents, the folks in their district, and then their colleagues. And so when you consider how the folks back home may influence how they vote, that brings us to this issue here of the representative style of a member of the House and the Senate. And so should they be voting based on what the constituents want, based on their phone calls, emails, letters, town hall meetings, that they get a sense that people want them to vote yes on a particular bill, let's say? Should that be the main factor, or should it be that they vote according to his or her own conscience, the individual member of Congress's conscience? And even if that means that it goes against the way many people feel in that district. And so that's the contrast that we see there between delegate and trustee. So look that over and consider which one you would want the most in a member of the House and the Senate. Would you want them to be a delegate, or would you want them to be a trustee? Okay, that's what we have there with Congress. We'll be turning our attention next to the presidency.